My dear ones, what have we observed the costs to be of violence? What do we know the costs of violence to be? Loss of safety, fear, loss of life, loss of security, loss of trust, a loss of sense of one's moral integrity, of one's worthiness, sometimes one's loss of self-worth, of belonging, of connection, pain, fear, anger. All of these and more can be the costs of violence. I think it's important to name them and know that the costs of violence can be a lot, because violence is so regularly a part of our lives in small ways and in significant and ongoing and lasting ways. And yet humanity has often let violence continue as if it were a fact of life, an immutable fact of life, instead of a practice to be ended. So, in the face of violence, what are our options? The first one is to respond in kind, to respond with force meeting like force, i.e., to respond with more violence, whether that be spiritual, verbal, psychological, or of course, physical. Another option has been resignation, acceptance, and a willingness to endure or survive, even if one cannot thrive. Sometimes in religious spaces, there is an emphasis on the life to come, a kind of rebirth or salvation, where one's sufferings will be relieved and sometimes even rewarded. And then the final one is nonviolence. And maybe you could even hear in this word that it is an idea that we don't even yet have language for. We know what violence is, but nonviolence across all the languages gets described as the opposite of violence. Today, let us help to understand more what nonviolence is and why it is a practice of the beloved community. Now, this understanding that there is a way to, another way of being and responding in the world, this nonviolent way of being and responding in the world, is found in some fashion, language, practice, understanding in all the major ancient world religions. In our contemporary world, our understanding of it was most shaped and introduced to us by Gandhi. Gandhi was perhaps the most significant political figure of the 20th century. And yet that is not where his understanding of nonviolence began. He, of course, was deeply influenced by Hinduism and the other South Asian world religions that he studied. But he credits actually his understanding of nonviolence and disruptive nonviolence to begin with to have been taught to him by his wife, Kasturba. Gandhi and Kasturba had an arranged marriage. They got married when they were 13 and began living together when they were 16. Now, you know 16-year-olds and I know 16-year-olds. So even though this first household union of theirs was quite some time ago, I'm sure you can imagine how out of his depth Gandhi felt. So what does Gandhi, the soon-to-be lawyer, do? He went to the library for answers. He took out these pamphlets and books about how to be a husband, and these books, as was common in his day and not yet uncommon in our day, portrayed the duties of a husband in a way that was, let's say, domineering. And they were very clear that Gandhi's role as a husband would be to lay down the rules for Ketsurba and to enforce them. And Gandhi followed this strictly. One of the rules that he insisted on was that she not leave the house without his permission. And yet the day after informing her that she was not to leave the house without his permission and the consequences thereof, Ketsurba left the house. And she continued to leave the house, not notifying him, not asking for his permission, not apologizing for doing so. And finally, he said to her, "Ketsurba, I'm the husband and you are the wife and you will obey me." And she very gently said, essentially, "Thank you, my husband, for sharing this with me. I have been trying to figure out how to be a good wife, and so I asked your mother, and she provided the household guidance for how I should be a wife. And I've been taught to respect my elders. Should I now go and tell her that I will listen only to you and no longer to her?" Now, Gandhi pretty immediately knew that that was not a message he wanted his mother to hear about him. And the argument was quickly solved that he was no longer going to lay down the law in the house. So this is the way Ketsurba achieved liberation within her own household. You might be able to hear in that story how nonviolence isn't passive, it is active. What does nonviolence actively do? It actively disrupts instances of harm and patterns of violence. Nonviolence actively disrupts instances of harm and patterns of violence. When I think about that harm and violence, what immediately comes to my mind, and I'm sure comes to many of your minds as well, are the systems of oppression, economic oppression, racism, gender and sexuality-based oppressions, and how those systems of oppression are often actively kept in place through the threat and instigation of harm and violence. And so nonviolence actually has a way of challenging those systems. It's actually, when you study those in power, they've been most threatened by those who practiced nonviolence. They consider nonviolence the most dangerous idea to their seat of power. What would it mean for us to adopt nonviolence? In our own context, Gandhian principles of nonviolence were brought to America by Martin Luther King Jr. And he had 5 guiding principles of hallmarks for nonviolence. The first one is that we can resist evil without resorting to violence. A pretty recent example of this is the result of a 2015 fire in Bucharest at a nightclub. There was an Oscar-nominated film, The Collective, that talks about how corruption led to the death of 64 people in that nightclub. Because of this, and how it showed the real harm that corruption, disinterest, and greed play in the system, whistleblowers have been exploding all around them, making sure that workplaces are safer, that places of recreation are safer, that hospitals are safer, that the chemicals and products they buy are safer. There is a mass movement to say we need to ensure that our world is appropriately safe. And none of this involved any violent retaliation. King's second principle for those who seek to engage in nonviolence is that we must seek to win the friendship and understanding of our quote unquote opponent and not try to humiliate them. I actually have an example of this from my own life. Several years ago, when I was the minister in Indianapolis, I helped my congregation put together this year of learning on anti-racism. It had a number of different components and resources to it, but it also featured 4 sort of signature programs or speakers. The third of which was Robin DiAngelo, and the fourth of which was Paula Cole-Jones, who, if you do not know her, she is the co-author of our 8th principle and a lifelong Black UU here in the DC area. Paula and I had met about 16 years ago at this point, and we had met while serving on the board of All Souls in DC. And I had stayed in contact with her over the years, mostly through Facebook and then through occasional conversations. And I could tell that she had something to offer. And we actually had put her in the program before she had introduced the 8th principle, but we're very excited to have her come, particularly after its introduction. Of all the different programs, my congregation actually felt most prepared and engaged after Paula's workshop. And I think it was because she offered a framework that built upon Robin DiAngelo's work, but actually took it to a higher level of competency, of skill and competency for how to understand yourself and understand others as we move forward in anti-racism work. She also had a way of helping us understand how to strategically analyze our congregation and move groups into a place of engagement and allyship when it came to anti-racism. And both of those, the identity piece and the strategy and analysis pieces, were really powerful to our congregation. After she came, she and I had a conversation. She wanted to know how her workshop went because she wanted to see if there's anything that I noticed or we noticed and observed that we wanted to say, this was fantastic, or that we said, here's some places that we were confused by or wanted to learn more about or just didn't connect with, because she was hoping to offer this program again. I had such positive feedback and gratitude to offer her. As part of this, I remember I was outside enjoying the beautiful summer weather when she asked me, she said, would it be okay if I asked you how much you paid Robin DiAngelo? And I told her, and the price was about five times what we had paid Paula. And what we had paid Paula was actually more than we had budgeted. It was what she had asked and more than was typical for UU professional speaker fees, according to our denominational resource website. And I had zero concern about paying her what she asked. But Paula asked me to be thoughtful about the fact that we paid Robin DiAngelo, a white woman, significantly more money than her, a Black woman, and the effect that that had on Robin's livelihood and on her livelihood, and what that might say about the relative value of their offerings. Now, Paula could have been, and I think would have been absolutely justified to approach that disparity, that rather unjust disparity, from a place of anger. And she easily, I think, could have triggered feelings of white fragility or shame in me, not only as a white person, not only as a minister, not only as a decision maker, but also as someone who had known Paula for quite some time. And yet she didn't. And I don't know that the outcome necessarily would have been different, which is that in either case, I said to her I would think about that. I also made a wonderful point when other congregations, I made an intentional point when other congregations would come to me or other UUs and ask about my engaging Robin DiAngelo and the benefits of that. I would answer them, and they often ask the price, and I answer that too. And then I would share the value that we got out of Paula's visit and how she both charged less, but actually I thought that her value was equivalent in value and should be equivalent in terms of speaker fees as Robin, and that they might want to consider what specific learning engagement that they were hoping to accomplish and which of these two powerful educators would be the best fit for them. What I know is I was able to remain whole. I felt a great deal of love and gratitude towards Paula for treating me so gently. And I felt an ability to continue without break in our relationship. What I think Paula did as a nonviolent practice was engage in an understanding of mutual love. And I appreciate her so much for it and felt its powerful pull in my call to re-examine my own practices and to do differently and better in the future. King's third principle for nonviolence is that we must courageously resist evil itself, but not oppose the people committing the evil acts. One way that I like to translate this is that all people are welcome, but all behaviors are not. All people are welcome, but all behaviors are not, especially behaviors that harm, hurt, or inflict. King wrote and modeled himself that those committed to nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation. Yes, this non-retaliation is what breaks the cycle of violence. But I would disagree with King that a willingness to endure such suffering should be lifted up as redemptive. I never want to romanticize suffering or harm in any way. King's fifth principle is that the nonviolent resistor avoids both physical violence and internal spiritual violence. King wrote, "The nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, he refuses to hate his opponent." This is where we really understand that nonviolence is a spiritual practice. It takes a great deal of spiritual fortitude, engagement, and dedication to meet hate with love. Finally, King said that one must have a deep faith in the future. I understand this to be a type of resilient hope, to have a yearning, a desire, an insistence of the future that keeps one resilient. We need to be resilient for ourselves because our bodies and spirits and minds are breaking from all that we are asked to endure. And we must do this for our children and our grandchildren and our grandchildren to be. I insist on creating a world that I and they can have faith in. Proponents of nonviolence believe in it not only because of its moral authority, not only because they experienced the spiritual wholeness and integrity that comes with its practice, but also quite simply because it works. There's a Harvard professor named Erica Chenoweth. She began her career studying the strategic logic of armed resistance, and yet encountered a challenge. Why was she not studying nonviolent movements for change? Just out of curiosity, she looked into it, and she actually found that nonviolent campaigns were significantly more likely to be successful than campaigns pursued through violence. She noticed this because, first of all, nonviolent movements are able to sustain a large and diverse level of participation. The second thing is that nonviolent movements tend to elicit loyalty shifts among security forces in particular. And when the movement stays nonviolent, it restricts the level of violence security forces can direct at the movement. And then the third thing is there's just way more creativity about how to do civil disobedience or direct action or mobilization than there are around violent tactics. In fact, what was most striking is that Chenoweth was unable to find an example of any campaign where there had been at least 3.5% of the population engaged that had not been successful. Now, 3.5%, that's not nothing. In the US, across the country, that would be nearly 12 million people. But to think if 12 million people were advocating today for significant police reform, criminal justice reform, economic reform, labor reform, that we could be successful within a matter of months, that is profound to think about. I want you to know that as fully as we see the effectiveness of mass, politicized, strategic nonviolence as a tool to create broad and comprehensive and profound social change, I also as deeply believe in the proactive practices of nonviolence. The proactive practices of nonviolence. You might be wondering, what does she mean by that? When I think about proactive practices of nonviolence, I want to use a metaphor for you. Now, a number of years ago, several decades ago, there weren't that many regulations around driving, and specifically around highways. There weren't speed limits, for instance. Seatbelts weren't required, and there weren't guardrails along dangerous stretches of road. These regulations all had a singular intention to reduce the impact and the harm of driving, particularly driving dangerously or under dangerous conditions. I want you to think about the guardrail in particular. The guardrail is there to keep the cars on the road. So what are our guardrails as a community? The first of these guardrails is being covenantal. Have covenants with one another that point us towards nonviolent practices, that point us towards mutuality, that point us towards truth-telling, that point us towards transparency, that point us towards accountability, that point us towards an ethic of care. Because when you have those guardrails in place, it makes it much harder for us to enter into really dangerous, harmful terrains. The second guardrail is to have a practice by which we call people back in when we have some collisions or bumps along the road. And that is our practice of engaging in subtle acts of exclusion. Those words, actions, deeds, behaviors that work to harm or exclude someone, and allow us to engage in a process of acknowledgement, accountability, integrity, and humanity to call all parties back in to a community of greater safety. And the third proactive practice of nonviolence is to create a culture that understands and regularly and implicitly knows how to offer kindness, care, and expect contribution. Kindness, care, and contribution. Kindness by being warm and welcoming, gentle and loving, in short, kind, with our language and our expressions, in our body language as well. Care, to genuinely care and be concerned for the welfare of one another. And contribution, to expect that each one of us will somehow show up in a way to leave this community a little better than we found it. Care, kindness, and contribution have a way of inspiring those same postures in others. May we welcome people in with them, and may they leave with the blessing of them. So, my dear ones, we have a choice and a chance. Each and every moment, you have a choice with whether or not you will be nonviolent towards yourself. With each and every encounter, you have a choice whether or not to be nonviolent with the life that you encounter. And if we choose nonviolence, if we choose to actively disrupt patterns of harm and violence, we have a chance. We have a chance to disrupt the means by which systems of oppression are allowed and able to perpetuate themselves. Because no one wants to choose those ways, those oppressive ways. They're forced into them. And given an invitation out, we might just choose a loving, mutual liberation for us all. Let us take up that choice and chance in our own lives. May it be so, and blessed be, with love and joy. Amen.